Well, hello and welcome again. And this is going to be the second part of the information for the 1950s. And what we're going to look at here is the civil rights movement. I should probably say movements, but it's going to be, for our case, movement of the 1950s. And this is that other half of the walnut as we move into the 50s as an age of not conservatism, but as anxiety and whatnot. Lord, can't even think of the word I want to use. And I want to start off with this picture, and I've always used it because it is such a shock for students that I've taught, whether they're in high school or whether they've been college students like yourself. And when you see this young man here who's obviously African American having to drink from another water fountain, and you see separate restroom facilities, it's something that I simply have a hard time fathoming. With this because it's just not the way that I grew up, being born in 1970 and going to school, in 1976 with kindergarten. Everything was completely integrated in North Carolina by that point in time. And quite frankly, that's not how decent people acted. But as we go through the 1950s, that's going to be a whole brand new thing because what we're going to see here, this next slide, are a couple of things. We know about the NAACP. It was founded, out of the Niagara movement and from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. But by the 50s, you've got a little different animal brewing here in that the Klan is going to have some revival in the South, unlike the new Klan in the Midwest. And you see Emmett Till and what Emmett Till looked like there. Or you picture Thurgood Marshall down at the bottom. You're going to see such hatred and retrenchment and balkanization in parts of the South, whereas you're going to see startling advancements as a result of the Second World War on the other hand. And so when you see those, we move on with questions here. Number one is, what is the status of Southern black people in the 1940s? Well, what you're looking at is you had African Americans who served in the Second World War who were a tremendous part of America winning that conflict. And now you had a fight against fascists, which are nothing more than, and Nazis, which are nothing than thinly veiled racist. But now all of a sudden during the war, Americans were glad, hey, African Americans doing their part, so to speak. And after the war, it's like, okay, go back to the way things were before. No. And that's what people in the South won't, but that's not what African Americans want to stand for. Not now. Maybe that was the case for a while when there was no real recourse, but now that you've seen the world in through the lens of the Second World War, it was not something that's going to be stood for. It's like, okay, now it's time for Reconstruction from the 19th century to come to fruition. And the second question is, what methods did whites use to maintain black civility? Well, there were Jim Crow laws, there were literacy tests, there were poll taxes, there were grandfather clause. There were all these things that today we look at and are patently unconstitutional and are patently just, I would use a weird word here, they're just bad. And so those methods were there, and it was steeped in society. It was handed down from generation to generation, and both African Americans and white people grew up in this thing. So there's some inertia there that takes over. See here, as you look at the 14th Amendment, that's 1868. That's after the Civil War. You look at this. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And then you see the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was in 1896, which is nearly almost 30 years, 28 years after the 14th Amendment's passed, that said separate facilities were equal. Were illegal as long as they were equal. But that definition of equal is going to take on a whole new world. And so when you look at that, how did the 14th Amendment and Plessy create that sense of inferiority? Well, Plessy is going to codify Jim Crow and segregation. And so there's always going to be this separate but equal, but separate is inherently unequal in so many ways. And that's going to hang around for about 60 years. And then another question is, how did the changes in the parameters of the NAACP argument create a sense of anxiety? Because now the NAACP has had enough of this. They have had enough of this foolishness, and now it's time to fight it, but they had to get a court case. And by the late 40s to early 50s, we're starting to see people be able to make the argument that separate is inherently unequal, and it have some legal weight. And we're going to see some images of that in the next slide. This particular poster that just popped up, I used to have in my classroom for well over a decade. May 17th, 54. That's when Brown versus Board is decided. Linda Brown had to go by a white school every day before to get to her school, which was a black segregated school. It was poorly funded, blah blah, anything you can think of like that. And they made the argument that having separate facilities was inherently unequal and made people have a sense of inferiority, and it violated their civil rights under the 14th Amendment. One of the cool stories about Linda Brown that I heard later was a friend of mine teaches in Topeka, Kansas, and she was telling me one day that she had a little girl taught middle school. This little girl comes up to her and said, "Can I have my grandmother come talk to us about segregation?" And Lucinda was like, "Well, yeah, we need to see what she knows." And come to find out, her grandmother was the Linda Brown that you see in the upper left-hand corner, and talking about history coming to life right there. It's not that far removed from us. And you see in the bottom left, you see people of all races and ethnicities together. That's the way we grew up from the 70s forward, at least that I can vouch for. So what you see is Brown versus Board of Education strikes the death nail to the segregation into Jim Crow. It's just once you've cracked the school system, you can crack the rest of it. It's just a matter of time before it can be chiseled out. Unfortunately, Chief Justice Earl Warren uses a phrase in his unanimous decision. I mean, he worked to make it unanimous. He said they must be desegregated with all deliberate speed. All deliberate speed is interesting in that in 1964, my parents graduated high school. Cleveland County Schools was not yet desegregated. That doesn't happen until the end of the 60s with the creation of Crest and Burns High Schools. South Carolina didn't desegregate until 73. I went to elementary school in 76. That's a little too close for comfort. So that's how it hampers it. It doesn't give a timeline. Well, that was a mistake on Earl Warren's part. And Eisenhower, for his part, what role did he play? Again, I told you I'm reading this book by his granddaughter, Susan, and she whitewashes this a little bit. Matter of fact, she doesn't even talk about it. And Eisenhower doesn't want to get involved. Number one, he thinks it's a state issue. Number two, it's going to make part of the country mad no matter what. So he tries to stay out. So that's the question. Could he have done more? He could have, but he eventually does. And he does it with Little Rock when he sends in the airborne and he federalizes the National Guard to integrate the schools. So Eisenhower, while he's a little slow on the uptake, he does eventually do it. Slide's got a lot of fun here. We talk about judicial activism and whether it's a problem. And people start talking about how Earl Warren it was unconstitutional what he had done because it was such a sweeping decision. Well, we all know the court does that. And there's a little cartoon down here at the bottom. The court, no crime can be punished without our say so, right? And nobody's in a position to keep us honest and yo-ho-ho in a bottle of rum. I think it's pretty hilarious because the 9 members of the Supreme Court do have that authority. And again, it's not found in the Constitution. Chief Justice John Marshall makes it up, back in 1802 in a case involving Thomas Jefferson, his cousin. So what you see there is you have this judicial activism, and a lot of the country is really ticked off over it. Whereas for us today, we're going, how could you be mad at this? This is ridiculous. All right? So the question becomes, was that Southern position reactionary or radical? And I think this is one right there where it's most definitely reactionary. And the other question is, what fears did whites have? Well, that's all kind of this racial amalgamation and this, that, and other. It's just a bunch of hokum. And were those fears realized? No. It's just a bunch of mess. It's kind of like the boogeyman hiding under your bed. So that Southern position is going to be very reactionary or wanting to go back to the way things were. I'm sorry, you can't put toothpaste back in the tube or the genie back in the bottle. And so this slide here is talking about President Eisenhower and his civil rights. I do believe we know the man on the left, far left, who's in the office with him there. That is none other than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And so Eisenhower is going to be a great civil rights president, though he doesn't quite get some of that play because he is a little slow to act there. Now, we've had Brown versus, but then we got to go to Montgomery, Alabama, and we got to talk about Rosa Parks. Because remember, the Montgomery, Alabama bus system was segregated. And what happens is she refuses to give up her seat. And, of course, they arrest her, blah, 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 charge her, pay a little bitty fine, and people go on. But what happens is Dr. King gets the NAACP and the rest of the black religious community to lead this boycott of the Montgomery bus system. And it hit the Montgomery bus system where it hurts in the pocketbook. And so what happens is Rosa Parks is not a cause per se, but she's more like a spark or more like just one of those milestones along the way, an incredibly important milestone in Montgomery. But she's one of those where it's not a cause of the civil rights movement. That thing was rolling as a result of World War II. And so, and the question is, why did Ike respond the way he did at Little Rock? Well, number one, he didn't want to do it. You know, he didn't want to get involved. Governor Oral Faubus of Arkansas test him because he won't do what the Supreme Court said do. Well, if you know anything about Ike as a military man, he's also a law and order man. And we can't have this. And he can't have a governor saying, you know what, we're going to ignore the Supreme Court. You know, we go back to Andrew Jackson in the 1830s when he said, Mr. Marshall's made his decision, now let him enforce it. Eisenhower's not going to let that happen on his watch. And much to his credit, he takes some very decisive action in sending in the airborne and sending in federalizing that National Guard so that Governor Faubus can't do anything. And so you see, I don't know about y'all, but I don't want to go into a school where you've got soldiers carrying rifles. That is a mess right there. You know, there's Orville Faubus going to slap him around a little bit, and there's he and Eisenhower. But Ike is going to take very decisive action and ensure that we have a desegregated school in Little Rock, much like the court said we did. And so we had to. So on this last little slide here, now this is pretty short and sweet, it says, why did the Montgomery bus boycott work? Because it hit him in the pocketbook. You can't sustain it. Where most of the riders on those buses were African American, and all of a sudden you're taking that away, guess what's going to happen? It's not going to last very long because the bus system is going to begin to lose money, or going to run out of money, and so they give in. And why was that nonviolence of King such a great tactic? Because the minute people get radical, you see it today in some of these cities, the minute people get radical and start tearing things up, blowing stuff up, and getting violent, the public turns against you. And so nonviolence, these people are saying, hey, listen, all we want is what the Constitution says we should have and what's right. And so what happened, you see a man who is a preacher and walking hand in hand, and all of a sudden people are like, yeah, you know what? This isn't right. And you get people my parents' age who are like, yes, who were at this point in time were growing up, they were in their teenage years, and are going, no, this is not correct. This is not the America that I want to grow up in. This is not what Lincoln and Gettysburg Cemetery called a new birth of freedom. We need to have that. And so this is a pretty quick overview of that civil rights movement, but your textbook, whether it's the physical one or the online one, does a much better job than I can with this. But just to understand that this civil rights movement doesn't end in 1960. It only accelerates. And Martin Luther King is going to be one of the men leading it, but eventually it's going to take on other leaders, and it's going to combine other groups, and you're going to see a civil rights and protest movement that is going to be incredibly vibrant by the mid to late 1960s. So I want to kind of stop it here because this gets us to that point. So we've had some radical change so far. We've had some incredible increases in civil rights. We have a Supreme Court unanimously saying, boom, separate but equal is not legal, and we're going to start to see that roll its way back through other areas of society. But it's not done because you have state governments in the South that are going to retrench. North Carolina is not immune to that. North Carolina is going to try to retrench as well, and you're going to see that come to a head in the 1960s.